Welcome back, DP Nation, to another episode. We are delighted to have you in the studio in the new year. So why don't you grab a drink, grab a notebook, a pen, and come along with us in this journey tonight.
With all of my heart, Lord, I will love you. With all of my soul, I'll give you praise. With all of my strength, I lift my hands, my voice. I worship you all my days. I worship you all my days. With all of my heart, Lord,
Welcome back, DP Nation. We are delighted to be in the studio with you again. We hope that you had an amazing Christmas and have had a happy New Year celebration and moving into the year 2025. It's here. We waited all of last year for it to get here, and it made it.
Yep,
Made it on time.
you're late.
And, yep. So we're delighted to have you with us, as I already stated. And no, we have not forgotten about you. If you didn't hear the last episode, we actually got locked out of our studio. It's pretty funny to get locked out of your own studio. And it took us several weeks to figure out how to get in the studio because we don't want to damage the studio to get into it. And then we got into the studio and we were able to record. And right now, between Christian Growth Center Pueblo and Christian Growth Center Greeley, the churches are growing, the churches are thriving, the churches are expanding. God is doing amazing things. There's a lot of great things in the work at both churches. And because of that, it has been all hands on deck. And we knew from the outset of this, we were going to get very busy. We also knew that we did not want to completely stop doing the Double Portion podcasts because we enjoy doing them on our end, and then we know that many of you faithful listeners, you enjoy the podcast as well. But for the sake of teaching Bible studies and making sure that we're connecting with all the people we need to connect with to keep the both churches moving forward, we had to take some time and step back. And we went to probably the next few months, 1 or 2 episodes a month. So we had one in December, probably have 1 or 2 in January and in February, and then we'll gauge things from there. So if you see a week where we don't drop an episode, we have not quit, we have not abandoned. It's just maybe a busy week, but we will get back in the studio and we will drop quality content like what we're going to drop tonight. I understand it's a new year and people have New Year's resolutions. This is the peak season for gyms and their memberships.
Yep.
This is the peak season for pretty much all memberships are going to go up, especially when it comes to health and focus, diet. Everybody's trying to lock back in, and that's good. I believe that we should start our year off with focus, direction, locking into what God has for us for that year. And hopefully you are doing that. Hopefully you're setting those goals for 2025 and also reflecting on 2024. Take some time to reflect back. Reflect on what you accomplished. Reflect on what you did not accomplish. And maybe how can you accomplish that this year? And then also reflect on all of the ways that God has brought you through. And rejoice. You're still here. At the beginning of last year, the devil had made up his mind he was going to take us out, and he failed. We all made it through another year, and God is faithful, and I'm sure all of you can attest to that as well. In this episode, we're going to talk about a man that I knew very little about until several weeks ago. I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, which is Truth Talks with Pastor Douglas Walker. And in one of his podcasts, he mentioned a man by the name of Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. And I knew very little about this man. In fact, if you had told me his name, I could not have told you anything about him. But as I began to study this man and just read through some articles about him, and then I listened to a book, an audiobook about him. It was like 7 or 8 hours. It was a pretty good book and that'll be the meat of what we're talking about tonight. But it began to refresh my memory a little bit. Some of this I went over probably in middle school, and in history in middle school, because it's dealing with getting to the North Pole and the South Pole, and traversing the Antarctic Peninsula, and that whole deal. So once I began to get into it, it began to kind of jog my memory. But, and we'll talk about it pretty in depth tonight, but I do want to encourage you, sometime get a book about Ernest Shackleton and his venture, or his journey, you could say his voyage, I guess, on the ship Endurance, when he tried to go all the way across the Antarctic continent by foot. And it is fascinating all that this man and his crew went through, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So you have Ernest Shackleton. He has several different goals in his life that he set out to do. One of them is he wants to be the first one to make it to the South Pole, and he gets beat. And it's pretty interesting time in history. Within 150 years or so of this, the United States has fought its way free from Britain. So that's it's a blow to the pride of England, that it is a global power. It was by far the most powerful empire of that time, and you have this little 13 colonies. They fight their way to freedom, and they fight their way to independence. So you have that, and there's several other places across the world that England is losing prestige. They're losing their honor, and they're losing the pride of being an Englishman. And so Ernest Shackleton, he plays on that for his funding. It's very interesting to watch him do this. He plays on that idea for his funding, and he says, look, we as Englishmen, we got beat here, and we got beat here, and we got beat here. But if you'll help me to accomplish this great venture, then we can restore some of the pride of being an Englishman. And he accomplishes getting his funding. He's able to secure funding for this voyage. He's able to secure a crew. And he talks about how the easiest thing by far to get was the crew. The hardest things were to get the funding and then to find the correct ship to do this, because they're going to be sailing in a wooden vessel. Now today you have icebreaker ships, and they just cruise through, and they have channels that are constantly patrolled, and the ice is constantly broken open in seas where it will freeze over. And so it's no big thing, you just have an icebreaker ship go in front of you. But back in the day, he's traveling in a wooden hulled vessel. And it's very easy for these things to get caught in the ice, and then the ice will shift and it'll crush the ship, and then you're stuck in the ocean without a ship. Mm-hmm. And so he's very particular about the vessel that he wants. And there's a lot of things that you can pull out of this to kind of to key in on. What we're going to focus on one thing specifically, so we'll skip some of these, and maybe some of you preachers out there or people that have podcasts or teaching, you can use some of these points. He's very particular about the vessel that he wants, and he's very good at getting people to buy into his vision, which is powerful. The ability to get someone to buy into your vision. If you can't get people to buy into the vision, then it becomes very difficult to lead people, and it becomes very difficult to keep people engaged. Yeah, people will buy in, and then they lose direction, or they lose focus, or they lose interest. And so you have to refresh the vision, and he's very good at doing this, Sir Ernest Shackleton. So he gets his funding. He plays this, we need to restore pride in England and the pride of being an Englishman. He plays it correctly. He casts the vision correctly. He gets his funding. Several large donors give to him. A man lets him buy his ship at a huge discount, which is the ship is called the Endurance, which is interesting because the ship doesn't actually survive. No. The ship doesn't survive, but it's called the Endurance. He gets his crew together. If I remember correctly, I want to say there's 27 crew members, and I was trying to find that, but I wasn't able to find it in time. But I think there's 23, 27, something like that. Those two numbers are sticking in my head. There's less than 30 crew members on the boat. They start out with 60-plus dogs to pull sleds. They lose all of the dogs by the time it's all
27.
said and done. What was that, man?
27.
27. Okay. Thank you, Brother Pound. That is our resident bot.
Yes.
Our resident
I
bot.
think wasn't one of them like a stowaway that ended up staying on there? Yeah.
Yes, he is a stowaway. And the thing is, he pays for it. By the end of it, he loses his foot to frostbite.
Oh my goodness.
So that's kind of a not that he loses his foot, but there's a humorous part to him being a stowaway because he slips. His friend brings him on the boat and hides him because he doesn't make the crew. And he's like, man, this is going to be such an amazing adventure. I want to make the crew. He doesn't make the crew. So his friend that did make the crew sneaks him on. They hide him in this locker for several days and like sneaking him food. And they get far enough out to sea to where the Endurance can't turn around and Shackleton is just going to have to accept, okay, this guy made it on. So he comes out of the locker. He gets discovered. Shackleton's irate because he's like, everything is so precise and so thought through and so balanced down to like every little detail of the things that they're ordering and the crew that's on the boat. And now he has this stowaway. And so he has the stowaway come come meet him in his cabin, and he's just berating the man, just chewing him out up one side and down the other. And the author of the book that I was listening to, he said they reached a point where Shackleton just stopped, and he became icy cold, just like icy cold. And he looks at the man, and he tells him, he's a young man. He looks at the young man, and he tells him, he says, you know what? He says, if we reach a point on this voyage where we run out of food, you will be the first man we eat. And then he just laughs and walks away. And that was like him welcoming this man to the ship. But by the time you reach the end of the voyage, that man, that stowaway, had done such a good job of pulling his weight and being engaged and doing his best to keep everyone alive that the crew as a whole, they no longer looked at him as a castaway. He was fully accepted as part of the crew because he was willing to do his work. So Shackleton gets all of his funding, and they have a goal of basically the Endurance will come in on one side of the island or of the Antarctic. All of the men will unload, and then there'll be a crew on the other side that goes, they have dogs and sleds, and they go about halfway. It's a smaller crew. They'll go about halfway, and they'll plant stashes of food that lead back to their side. And so Shackleton will go about halfway with his men, and then they'll start finding these caches of food and make it across. That was his original idea of crossing the Antarctic Peninsula. But when they get to the actual Antarctic, they get stuck in the ice. So there's different ice flows, and you can hop on YouTube and find, men and women that can explain this way better than me, but there's ice flows that flow in certain patterns, and they thaw out and they break as it reaches the summer season, and then they get denser and thicker through storms, weather patterns, the currents of the ocean, all kinds of stuff affect these what's called an ice pack, which is these huge fields of ice. Sometimes they're 10, 15, 20 feet thick, and they're, hundreds of yards long, and they'll drift together, and they'll literally make a floating ice island as far as you could see in every direction. The Endurance gets stuck in one of these.
Yes.
For 5 months, it's stuck in the ice, and they're just doing their best to survive in the ice. And in these 5 months, it reaches a point, there's what they call the crush or the pressure, where the ice pack will shift and it'll begin to go in a different direction, or two will start to go in two opposing directions, and they start to slowly crush the Endurance. And so the first few times this happened, the ship survives. It doesn't buckle. And so the men in the boat, they begin to have a false sense of security that the ice can't break the boat. The ice can't break the boat. And Ernest Shackleton does an amazing job of communicating to his men, like, look, guys, just because it survived once doesn't mean it will survive every time. And he's trying to to slowly let them, let the reality sink in that more than likely, guys, this ship is going to get crushed.
Yeah.
And we've got to start thinking we're in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
And our boat's about to sink, and how are we going to survive? So eventually the boat gets crushed. It gets pierced by the ice. They realize we can't fix it. There's no way to fix it. There's like main beams in the boat that get in the ship that are just completely shattered and buckled. So they have to abandon the ship. So they're in the middle of the island, or in the middle of the ocean, and now they don't even have a ship. So they live on the ice. And so during this 5-month process of the ship slowly sinking, and they're getting everything they can off of it. They're getting wood because, you're on ice. There's no trees to cut for firewood. They're having to hunt seals and different fish and different birds, penguins. They're living on seals and penguins. And I think they're called elephant seals. They're just giant. Anyway, you just listen to the book. I don't want to mess it all up, but they're living on these things. They reach a point where they run out of fuel, and so they're using blubber from the fish and the seals to burn as fuel to cook their food. If you're a dog lover, you're gonna get sad because he eventually has to kill all of the dogs. Yeah. And what's fascinating, and this is really what I want to hone in on, is there's points, and I strongly encourage you go listen to the book. There's going to be points when you're reading this book or you're listening to this about. In fact, let me find the book before I forget that I listened to. Give me one. It's called Endurance: Shackleton's Incredible Voyage. And it's by Alfred Lansing. The audiobook's 6 hours long. You could listen to it in a day if you had some time to just set aside and listen to it. So while you're listening to this or you're reading this book, you're gonna reach points where you become frustrated with Shackleton. For me, I'm a huge dog lover, and so he reaches points where he has to tell the sled crews to kill their dogs, and it's devastating to the crew because the dogs have become their companions. They become their friends. They're not just pulling the sleds, which were immensely helpful to move. They're moving these huge boats across the ice, the lifeboats. The dogs help with that. The dogs help them gather food. They would kill these big elephant seals, and then to get them back, some of these seals that they kill are 1,000 pounds. And so the dogs would help get them back to the base on the ice. And so you have this huge emotional connection to these dogs. And then he's telling the crews one at a time, hey, tomorrow you're going to have to go kill all of your dogs because we can't feed them. And you're just like, are you kidding me right now? Like, these are the friends of the men. They're already stuck on the ice. I think the total time that they're stuck on the ice or removed from civilization is like 18 months that they survive on the ice and or in the ocean. And then eventually they make it to a place called Elephant Island, which is just a barren rock that's out in the middle of this frozen ocean. And then on top of that, and we'll get to this in a minute, but on top of that, Shackleton makes a 700 nautical mile voyage in a 30-foot boat. He travels 700 miles through this ocean with 4 other guys or 5 other crew members to South Georgia, which is the closest men that they can get to. It's a whaling station. He travels this in a handful of days with the sole purpose of saving his men. Yeah. Nobody had ever done that before. In fact, when he finally makes it back to civilization, the men that have worked in this frozen ocean, their whole lives, they're blown away that this man did this. Yeah. To the point where they hold like a formal ceremony and they're giving him praise and just saying like, I just want to shake your hand because nobody's ever been able to do this. And he does it all for his men. So you're going to find places in the book where you're extremely frustrated with Shackleton. Like, why are you killing the dogs? It's not that much more meat for 20, 30 dogs to eat off of these huge seals that you're killing and all the penguins that are showing up. and it's morale for the men.
Yeah.
And there's other places where you're going to look at it and be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But this is what I want to hone in on. Shackleton takes 27 men and keeps all 27 men alive
It's amazing.
for 18 months,
Yeah.
living on the ice or in boats. At one point, when they finally make it to Elephant Island, there's 3 boats in the water, and they've been basically marooned without a boat. I think it's over a year at this point that they've been living on the ice or in these boats, and they're just trying to make it to a piece of land.
Yeah.
And they get into a storm, and the storm it's flooding the boats. But the problem is they can't bail the water fast enough, because as soon as the water gets into the boat, it turns into ice.
Yeah.
That's how cold it is. So they have to chip the ice out of the inside and throw it away. And, you have men that are sitting. It's 10 degrees outside,
Yeah.
Celsius, or, not Celsius, Fahrenheit. And then even colder, below 0 Fahrenheit. They're sitting in water.
Yeah.
And he keeps them all alive. Like, it's just mind-blowing how he kept them alive. Yes, like you have the one guy who loses his foot to frostbite, and some other men had some pretty, drastic fights with frostbite. But that's really the only one that even lost any limbs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have this man who, he has faults. He's not perfect. He can be very egotistical. He can be very prideful. He's a very big ego. But for all of his faults, he, in this scenario, is an excellent leader.
Yes.
He does an amazing job of keeping his crew together, of keeping their morale up, and
Yes.
just the thought, like when he has to go onto the ice, he knows that, these men are going to have to sleep in tents.
Yeah.
So he spends hours dividing the men correctly into tents so that each man that's put in a tent works best with all the other men in that tent. So there's no fights, because he knows if there's fights, it'll destroy morale. And if morale collapses, the men will fight and they'll all die. If they don't stand together, they'll die. So you have hours of thought that goes into, okay, who's going to sleep in tent A? Who's going to sleep in tent? I think they're numbered, not lettered, but, tent 1, tent 2, tent 3. Who's going to sleep in these tents? Again, when he goes on his voyage to go to South Georgia to get help, to get a rescue party to come back and get him, he doesn't just take his favorites, and he doesn't just take the most powerful men. Some of the men on that boat are the biggest troublemakers, and he takes them with him because he knows he can contain them. But if he leaves them on the island, they'll sow discord, and the discord will turn into low morale. The morale of the men will collapse, and they'll die. And so he'll come back, and instead of finding a full crew to rescue, he'll find a bunch of dead skeletons or dead frozen bodies. Just the thought of this, continually thinking about the crew, continually thinking about the men, and you see the expertise, and just you see through all of this story a great leader leading. And he does it. He reaches South Georgia. He does many things on this voyage that are fascinating. One of them, he keeps a whole crew alive for 18 months without a boat, which is just amazing, in the Arctic. Then he goes 700 miles in a little lifeboat in some of the dangerous, roughest seas in the world, the most dangerous, roughest seas in the world. Then when he gets to South Georgia, he's the first man to ever traverse all the way across that island, because it's so rough and it's so harsh, the terrain. When he gets there, nobody had ever mapped the island, and he knows his men aren't strong enough, and his boat's too damaged to put it back in the water and sail around to where the whaling station is. So he goes across an island that everyone said it's impossible, you can't do it, and he does it. Then he takes a boat back. He tries 2 or 3 different times and he can't make it. And then finally he gets through the ice pack, and he gets his men, and he gets all of them out. He takes his entire crew back,
Yeah.
and they all survive,
Yeah.
which is just mind-blowing. One of the things in the book that stood out to me is how far the human
Yes.
being can just be subjected to just horrible situations and live.
Yes.
And many of the men in their journals, they write about that, like how they can still find happiness. They're literally eating. By the end of it, they're eating the dogs.
Yeah.
They're eating the dogs. They're eating anything they can find: seals, sea lions, fish, birds, penguins, anything they can find. They're eating it, and they're still happy.
Yes.
And so that's fascinating to me. But the part I want to drive home is, in closing this out, is the absolute necessity of having a good leader in your life.
Yes.
If
Huge.
there had been a bad leader in this situation, nobody would have survived. If there wasn't that caliber of man that was willing to recognize, more than likely the ship is going to sink, we're going to be stuck on the ice, and I've got to get my crew back to civilization. No matter what it costs, I've got to get us all back alive. They would have died.
Yeah.
But because they had a good leader and they were willing to follow that leader, nowhere. And the part you see this the clearest is probably when they're having to kill the dogs, because all the men are talking about how they love the dogs.
Yes.
Uh,
I think something, and I don't mean to cut into, but his ability, and you've mentioned this, but his ability to maintain the morale, to keep the division out of there, because I think there was one or two times where he could have lost it, like you saw, where his attitude was about to just, but he just maintained it. When there was division between men, he learned how to split them up. It's incredible. And especially when you have something like a dog where people are actually growing affectionate, and you're able to navigate that where they're still happy at the end of the day. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. And you see their ability to trust their leader, because he'll go to a dog team leader, and he'll tell him, hey, tomorrow you and his second in command, I can't remember his name right now, but you and this guy, his first mate, you're going to have to go out and shoot the dogs. And not a single person questioned him. It was the understanding of, okay, I don't agree with this. Oh, there were times that behind his back, they were furious, but nobody questioned him. They just understood, okay, this is what we've got to do. There's one place in the whole time where a man basically sits down in the snow and tells him, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not doing what you tell me to do, Shackleton. And his excuse is, we're not on the boat. The boat's gone, so you're not my captain. And Shackleton doesn't get in a yelling match with him. He doesn't tell him, well, I'm your captain, you're going to do, He gets down in the ice with him and talks him out of this depth of just quitting. And the man makes it out.
Yeah.
He makes it out. And so you see in this story the necessity of having a good leader, but not only having a good leader, obeying that leader.
Yes.
Where there's times where Shackleton's doing things, it doesn't make sense. And you're like, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. But whether he's right or wrong, he got his whole crew through alive. And that was the goal. And the two people in the Bible that I thought about the most while I was listening to this, there's dozens of people you could use, but the two that I thought about probably get used the most in this comparison, I thought about David and Saul. And the reason why I thought about David and Saul is they actually have the same leader. They have the same shepherd or overseer, and it's Samuel.
Yeah.
Samuel is one of the most powerful biblical figures that you will find. He is a linchpin or a changing point for so much in Scripture, and he is such a powerful prophet. The Bible says of Samuel that not a single prophecy or a single word that Samuel uttered fell to the ground, but God fulfilled everything Samuel said. It shows you the love that God had for Samuel and the authority and power that Samuel had with God.
Yeah.
And so in this scenario, in this account in the Scriptures, it's not that they didn't have a good leader. It's that one chose to follow that leader and listen to him, and the other one chose not to. And they both start out the same. Both Saul and David are anointed by Samuel. Both Saul and David are called of God. They're both called for the same thing, to be the king of God's chosen people on earth. And somewhere along the line, Saul made it up in his mind that I don't have to listen to Samuel. And there's tens of thousands of hours of preaching and tens of thousands of pages of writing about all of the things that transpired in Saul's life, why he ultimately rejected God and God's ways and obeying the man of God, and because of that, God rejected him.
Yeah.
And we're not going to dive into that. You know, I'm sure if you've been in church for any length of time, your pastor has taught on that. But David chose to follow the man of God, and he made it all the way through. Saul failed as a king, and David succeeded as a king. There's other places in the Bible where you can bring this up. But the fact remains, and I wanted to use Ernest Shackleton, so you'll go read about him and study him, and you can study just a fascinating piece of history and a good leader as far as that voyage. There's other things he did in his life that weren't right, but as far as that voyage, he got it right. And then to apply that to ourselves in 2025, at the beginning of this year, making sure we have the right leaders in our lives, making sure that we have the pastor that God gave us, that we have the overseers or the over shepherds that God gave us, that they're in place, that we are aware of who they are, and they are aware that we are submitted to them. And then to submit to them. If they tell you something that you like, it's easy to do it. But if they tell you something you don't like, that's when you find out if you actually have a pastor or not.
Yeah.
When he says, I don't think you should do that, and you find it in yourself to say, okay, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
That is the test of if someone is your pastor or not. The moment that they tell you no, and you want to do that thing, do you have it inside of yourself to back up and say, okay, I'm going to obey them? Do you have it inside of yourself like those men when Shackleton looks at you, proverbially, and Shackleton looks at you and says, go shoot the dogs. And everything inside of you says, no, I'm not going to shoot the dogs. Do you have what it takes inside of you to say, okay, I'm going to submit to this, and I'm going to submit to this authority, and I'm going to be obedient? And they did, and they survived. They made it out. They lived. And that's the goal. The goal is to survive, to make it to heaven. That's the goal. And to be honest with you, DP Nation, if we don't have a shepherd in our life, we're not going to make it to heaven. No. We're going to get torn to bits by the ravaging wolves of the spiritual world, and we won't make it. But if we have a shepherd, if we have an overseer, and we're willing to submit to that and submit to that process and stay in alignment with that leader, even when we feel like we're stuck on the ice and we're drifting around and we're wondering, what in the world are we doing? And everything's horrible and it doesn't make sense, and they're telling you to do things that don't make sense. And you can still say, you know what? I know this is the pastor that God gave me, and I'm going to submit to this. And in the end, you'll make it, and you will be just like that Shackleton's crew, to where after when they end up on Elephant Island, they set a date, and they set it way off in the future. They know that for Shackleton to make it to South Georgia is going to take maybe a week or 2 weeks of sailing if he gets through. But then they give him some space and time to get a crew together to come back to save them. And the crew actually reaches a point where they all think Shackleton died. They're like, he didn't make it through. He didn't die. Or he didn't make it through. He died. The ship sunk or something went wrong. He's not coming back. But nobody's voicing that. They're all still clinging to the last dregs of hope. And he shows up just a few days after that. They set a date that says, okay, by this date, and it's months in the future, by this date, if Shackleton is not back, we know he's dead. And we got to effect another way to save ourselves. And just a few days after that is when he shows up. And it's shocking to the crew to see another boat. Like, Shackleton actually came back for us. He actually got us out. And so I encourage you, read the book. It's a good book. It's a short book, but it's a good book. But more importantly than reading the book, the beginning of this year, make sure you have the right leader in your life, and make sure that you will obey that leader and follow that leader. Because to be honest with you, and I'm not saying that you should just blindly follow anyone, and I'm not saying that, as a leader, you should be able to tell anyone to do anything. It doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense. No, a leader has, especially a pastor or a shepherd, has to lead according to the Word of God. If it's in the Bible, they're allowed to talk about it. They're allowed to lead in that aspect.
Yeah.
If it's not in the Bible, then they need to tread very carefully, because we're not pharaohs.
Yeah.
Leaders are not pharaohs.
Yeah.
We're shepherds. We don't drive the sheep. We lead the sheep. We guide the sheep. And so I'm not abdicating for blind obedience to where they can tell you to do anything, and there's never any sitting down with your leader in the proper manner and saying, okay, this doesn't make sense. Can you explain this to me? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, make sure that you have a pastor in your life.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're submitted to that pastor, to where that pastor can tell you no, and you don't get mad and fly off the handle, and you look at that man of God and you say, yes, sir.
Yeah.
And you align yourself to that authority, because there's going to come a time, probably multiple times in our lives, when spiritually the ship sinks and we're stuck on the ice and we're eating the dogs and eating penguins and wondering, are we ever going to make it through this? Are we ever going to survive this? But if you have a God-ordained leader, if you have the right leader in your life,
Yeah.
then you'll make it through. The closest example to this is, it happens with the Apostle Paul. He gets in a storm. He's in a ship. He's not in the Arctic. He's not in Antarctica. He's in the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah.
And they know the ship's going to sink. They know it's just a matter of time. They basically have given up all hope of controlling the ship. The storm's just throwing it wherever they want. They haven't eaten for, I think it's like almost 2 weeks that they haven't eaten, trying to keep themselves alive from the storm. And then Paul gets up and he says, an angel came and stood by me last night. Well, he actually says the angel of the Lord, which makes me wonder if it was God, if it was Jesus.
Yeah.
He says the angel of the Lord came and stood by me last night and told me that no one is going to perish if we'll just obey. In that instance, they had the right leader and they listened to him.
Yeah.
And everyone survived the shipwreck. They all made it to the island and they all lived. And so even in the Bible, you see this scenario to where DP Nation, if we have the right leader in place, when the storm hits and all chaos breaks loose and you're questioning, am I going to survive this storm? If you have the correct leader in place, then that leader will come to you at just the right moment with a word from God and say, if you will do thus and thus, you will survive this storm. And then when we do it, we can rest assured that we will survive the storm. We may lose the ship. We may have to swim to shore. We may have to go through a lot of things, but we'll survive. And in the end, we will make it to heaven.
Yes.
So that's it for tonight, DP Nation. Stay tuned. We are building a list of guests that we would love to have on, people here at Christian Growth Center Pueblo, and then people outside of Christian Growth Center, different leaders and voices of the apostolic movement that we would love to have them come on the podcast and speak into our lives, speak into your life. So stay tuned. There's going to be exciting things this year. But most importantly, make sure you have the right leader and then get to working on the goals that God has for you this year. And we're going to do the same. Let's get out there, DP Nation, and have revival. We love you. We'll catch you on the next one.